Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. I want to welcome to the program Jackie Flynn Mogensen, a reporter covering science and health at Mother Jones. Jackie, there's a lot we could probably talk about that, but let's specifically talk about the NIH. The NIH had its funding frozen. Is that right? I mean, as part of like the first wave of fund freeze that came out. Just give us a little bit of timeline because so much has happened just in the past 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. Really excited to talk about this issue. So basically what happened before this week's funding freezes on grants and loans coming from the federal government, last week, researchers at NIH were instructed to pause communications, pause travel, and there was also a freeze to grant review panels, which a lot of researchers have been sounding the alarm about. I know it sounds kind of logistical and boring, but this is how money gets from places like the NIH to researchers at universities.
Let me just stop you here. Yeah. Will you explain to people, I mean, first I want to start with, like, what is the NIH? Like, what do they do?
That is a great question. The NIH is National Institutes of Health. They provide something like $40 billion every year to outside researchers. That's 60,000 grants a year that go out across 2,500 different institutions in every single state. And the research that they are funding has really important implications. There's been research that shows for every dollar the NIH funds, they get more than $2 back in economic activity. And so this is research on everything from cancer, diabetes, infectious disease like HIV, stuff that affects everyday Americans across the country. And so when there was a pause to reviewing new funding, these meetings take months and months to plan. And so people basically are saying that without these scheduled meetings, we're not allowed to get funding out. And so then this week, there's even a broader pause to funding, which a lot of universities are very concerned about. And so what I'm hearing from my sources is this is kind of just an all-out blackout on research that's happening right now. And it's very, very concerning and a very surreal time to be a science reporter.
I before we get into that part of the research and like sort of what we get out of that, and why it's not something, and why we feel the immediacy of that issue, as opposed to like, oh, this is something maybe 6 months down the road, or a year down the road, or 5 years down the road. But I want to talk about the communications for a moment. Like, what is the relevance of the CDC, of the NIH, of all of these health agencies not being able to communicate? And what do we mean by they're not able to communicate?
Right. Yes. So the memo that was sent out from the Trump administration essentially instructed all staff within the Department of Health and Human Services, which includes, as you mentioned, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, NIH, and the Food and Drug Administration to stop communicating publicly for the moment. And so that means social media posts, that means reports about disease outbreaks, that means public briefings. Some scientists at NIH were concerned and confused about whether or not they could still attend conferences, like giant cancer meetings of researchers where they get together to talk about the latest research. And so it's really just extremely broad and extremely concerning what the pause applies to. And beyond that, in addition to the communication and travel pause, as I reported recently, there was also a memo sent out to many people within the federal government, but we're talking about Health and Human Services, instructing staffers to report their colleagues if they are aware of any efforts to disguise DEI efforts. And so that's a whole other can of worms that has people.
We're going to talk to Ellie Mistel about that in a little bit. I mean, yes, the turning everybody into like a little Gestapo in the workplace is sort of a generic across the board, I guess, the edict. So in terms of this communication, in normal times, if we have the, let's say, I don't know, largest TB outbreak that we've had in the history of the country in Kansas, let's say, just hypothetically, although this is exactly the case, what would the CDC be doing differently, or what other health agencies would be doing differently? I mean, follow enough news that I can see a report in, some Kansas newspaper. But what would the CDC, what value is it to me as an average American that these health agencies have the ability to communicate that there's a big TB outbreak?
Right. So the CDC is the primary agency tasked with reporting the cases known cases of a disease outbreak. So if there was a TB outbreak, for instance, CDC collects reports across all of the states and keeps a tally of where the outbreak is happening, how many people it's happening to, and works to help contain it, and also communicates to people about what is the actual risk of things. We saw this during COVID. CDC was having regular briefings. And so if you imagine something like, say, a pandemic occurring at a time like this, it would just be a complete disaster.
And getting back to that sort of return on investment for the NIH grants, like how does that manifest itself? I mean, like, for instance, I know that it was the National Institute on Aging, and I think the VA that did, and I just picked this one because it's the most, sort of the most popular drug right now, but did funded research on that Gila monster big lizard whose spit turns out to be like the hormone GLP-1, which is, basically Ozempic. And, there's issues obviously with Ozempic, I think, but right now it looks like it's going to both. Well, it's obviously made a ton of money for a couple of big pharmaceutical companies, but it's also going to save the U.S. money in terms of like Medicare, Medicaid, diabetes, all that kind of stuff, and all the other sort of like knock-on impact of people having weight issues. But where does this NIH funding happen? And like, how are we going to see the impact of just even like a 3 or 4 week or month moratorium?
Yes, absolutely. So NIH invests in a lot of different research, so it's almost hard to kind of like distill it down to just a few areas. But some big impacts are patents, disease, medicine development, jobs. Those are the things that the NIH delivers in terms of economic output. It's really interesting you brought up Ozempic because one thing I had heard from researchers is that this pause is particularly concerning because research isn't exactly linear. You might be studying something like large reptiles and discover a drug like Ozempic, and that's exactly what happened in that case. And so there's a big concern that by kind of forcing people to study what the administration deems appropriate, that it will stifle innovation in all sorts of different areas. And that's one of my favorite things about science is how it's pure and it's question-based and curiosity-based. And by limiting what people can study, there's a real concern that it might limit, innovation and eventually treatments and medicines.
What is your sense? I mean, I don't know if you've been able to do too much reporting in this in terms of like downstream, but I got to think, I mean, and this applies to millions of people and then millions more, I guess, maybe who might be in school. But when people who are in some way touched by the NIH or any of this funding freeze, have you talked to people who are like, I'm not looking obviously to become a multi-millionaire by doing this research or whatever it is, but I also don't want to live with the anxiety of like, I don't know, like an actor or something, not knowing if my next gig is happening. I mean, the idea is that people like a certain amount of employment security. Have you talked to people who are like, this is making me question my entire the life's plan?
Absolutely. I have talked to people within NIH and I've talked to people outside of NIH, just researchers at universities who are concerned about this. Within the NIH, what I'm hearing from my sources is that morale is very low. People are considering leaving. And in fact, there was an email memo sent out from the Trump administration, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, encouraging people to resign, making it easy for them to resign. And so I think there's kind of this feeling, at least within the federal government, from what I'm hearing from the people I'm talking to, of that they feel they're being demonized or their work isn't valued. And that's really tough because a lot of these folks could be making some higher salaries if they were to go into industry or come out of the federal government. Within academia, so in universities and things like that, people are also feeling this kind of morale sink, which is really concerning. You know, I spoke to a researcher who's federally funded, but works at an outside university, who said they'd rather go into industry before they move to Florida, you know, where they're subject to certain policies that they thought they couldn't work under those conditions. So it's
what
just
is
really
the move to Florida? What is that about?
So they basically they're based in California, and so they had said, like, I'd rather stay in California where my work is possible to do before I move to another state that has these kind of restrictive policies. In this case, the researcher I was speaking to is trans, and you can I did a report talking to a bunch of different people about concerns like this, but the kind of not just attacks on science, but attacks on identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion measures is also part of the whole picture here of why science could be impacted.
What do you have a sense looking forward, like what's the next steps of this, or are you just as much in the dark as everybody else?
So when I put out my story on NIH on Friday, there was a lot of confusion as to why the communication pause, why the travel pause, why are we putting a pause on reviewing research right now? And what's become clear in the days since that published is that the administration, from what I can interpret from their memos that have gone out to staff and reporting by journalists at the Washington Post, Times, and others, is that there is an intention to review the grants and research being done to make sure it complies with President Trump's executive orders. So those are executive orders that include de-emphasizing environmental justice and, as I mentioned, rooting out DEI efforts. And so I think there's a real concern. It's somewhat speculative at the moment that researchers who research touches DEI even a little bit might have their funding cut either now or in the future. And that's not just, measures to increase diversity. That's also people who study disparities, health disparities, and health concerns that affect the population differently. So that's very concerning. And
there's no real definition for what the Trump administration is talking about, right? Because, I mean, if you are, you're talking about researching, it seems like for whatever reason, all the oil refineries happen in low-income neighborhoods, or this is a disease. I mean, just a reminder for folks, I don't think we funded disease as it specifically impacted women until the early 90s, right? I mean, that there was no, do I have that right?
There's certainly been a lack of underfunding for health issues that affect women, certainly.
And presumably we don't do that for, across the board. We have this sort of like notion of this is a prominent disease that can strike people. But really, when we say people, what we're talking about more often than not is white men. And whether that's was on purpose or just the nature of our society, the idea is assessing those things and dealing with those deficits in the way that we provide healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot of chaos and confusion of what they mean by DEI, and recently in some communications have included DEIA for accessibility, and so I think people, honestly, maybe it's the chaos is the point in all of this. The confusion is the point. But yeah, a lot of people I've been talking to aren't sure exactly what that means. If it means their research on cancer rates across, Black women versus white women, maternal mortality, things like that will be affected. They just don't know. So that's one thing that I'm definitely staying on in the coming weeks to continue looking at.
Yeah, I think that the chaos is the point. But Jackie Flynn Mogensen, we will put a link to your piece, What the Hell is Going On at the NIH, at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube description. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.